The Prime Minister says people in Saskatchewan will still get their full carbon tax rebates despite the fact the provincial government is refusing to collect and remit that tax on home heating.
Despite the disagreement I have with the provincial government here in Saskatchewan on them not wanting to pay the federal government what is owed, the Canada carbon rebate checks going to families in Saskatchewan will not be impacted by the government of Saskatchewan's decision.
Just last hour, Dustin Duncan, the Saskatchewan minister responsible for Sask Energy, reacted to this news.
Government giving back the people of Saskatchewan the money that they've collected from them on the carbon tax, I think, from that standpoint, I think it's a good thing. Our view is still that they shouldn't be collecting it in the first place.
All of this comes as environmental issues get some added spotlight here in the national capital, with representatives from more than 170 countries meeting in downtown Ottawa. They're working to create a legally binding global agreement on plastics pollution. To talk about all of this, I'm joined now by the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Stephen Guilbeault. Minister, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, David.
How did the government, how did Cabinet land on this decision not to dock the rebates going to Saskatchewan? It had been suggested by Cabinet ministers in the past that there might be a reduction in the rebate. Why decide to go with the full amount despite what's happening there?
Well, you heard from the Prime Minister. The people of Saskatchewan should not be penalized because of the irresponsibilities of the provincial government with carbon pricing, and they should, and as the Prime Minister said, they should still get the carbon rebate. There's no option where Saskatchewan cannot not pay what is owed to the federal government. And as the Prime Minister said, the Canadian Revenue Agency has some tools at its disposal to ensure that the money that's owed will be paid.
The last time Premier Scott Moe was on this program, he said to me that his government had been contacted by the CRA in some form about this. Is that where your government is going to leave this battle with the Canada Revenue Agency and its collection powers and maybe federal tax court, and sort of avoid a political conflict or seek a political remedy to this? Just leave it to the CRA?
You've heard from the Prime Minister. We have every confidence that the Canadian Revenue Agency will be able to deal with this.
There's been some question, just as a final point on this, that maybe the government should look at other options, like withholding transfers from other programs. Is that something you would consider if Saskatchewan doesn't end its defiance over collecting and remitting the carbon tax, or is that completely off the table for your government?
Let's be clear here. Saskatchewan is breaking the law. And I don't think that as a responsible government, we should respond by breaking laws ourselves, by withholding transfers that are supposed to go to Saskatchewan. That's not how a country that's governed by laws should be doing its business. If Scott Moe decides that that's how he wants to do it, that's not how we're going to do it at the federal level.
Okay, I want to switch, if I can, to the issue of the day where you are. You spent the day at the UN Global Plastics meeting trying to work on a treaty with representatives from more than 170 countries to create this legally binding global agreement on plastics pollution by the end of this year. You announced plans yesterday for the Federal Plastics Registry. What can you tell me about what that is designed to achieve and how that is being received today?
So you can think about it, think about this plastic registry, how one would think about the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory report that we publish every year that allows us to see, sector by sector, jurisdiction by jurisdiction in Canada, what is happening with our greenhouse gas emissions. Are we heading in the right direction? Are different sectors pulling their weight? Do we have to readjust some of our policies, measures, investment to ensure that we are getting to where we need to go when it comes to fighting climate change? We need the same type of tools to fight plastic pollution. Right now, if we were to try and measure our progress on fighting plastic pollution, we have no baseline. So that registry will allow us to know what kind of plastics are being used in Canada, where are they being used, and what happens at the end of the life of those plastics. It will be a very transparent and public instrument that experts, scientists, environmental organizations, anyone who's interested will be able to have access to and to see what is happening with the production and use of plastics in Canada.
So could this eventually lead to a reduction in plastic production, Minister? Because we measure emissions as a way of finding ways to reduce emissions. And I know this is about plastic pollution and not plastics in totality. But groups like Greenpeace have been asking for a reduction in the amount of plastics being produced as a way to curb waste. Is that part of where this is going?
So just so people understand where we're coming from, 2 years ago in Nairobi, all of the world's countries agreed that we wanted to fight plastic pollution. In fact, we wanted to have an internationally legally binding treaty by the end of 2024, so at the end of this year, to ensure that by 2040, we have eliminated plastic pollution. So not the use of plastics. Obviously, plastics play a very important role in our society in a number of applications, airplanes, appliances, the medical sector. But clearly, they are those plastics that we should get rid of because they can't be recycled, which is why Canada has put in place a ban on single-use plastics. Many other nations are doing that as well. For those plastics that are playing this very essential role in our society, we need to make sure that we give those plastic value so that they stay in the economy and they stay out of our environment and more out of human bodies, because there's a emerging body of scientific evidence that we are finding plastic pollution in our brains, in our bloodstreams, in the placenta of women. So it's not only an environmental catastrophe, but it's becoming a public health crisis.
Right, and certainly you're going to need plastic products for the electric vehicles we're going to make, and the part of that transition you're going to need them for medical procedures.
That's correct.
But you mentioned the ban on single-use plastics. This was overturned by a court here in Canada. Your order on that, and I know you're appealing that. But how does that legal setback and uncertainty affect your ability to make commitments in a global treaty when you have this domestic challenge at play?
So we have appealed the decision by the federal court judge, and we've asked for a stay of that judgment as well. So the regulation still applies in Canada. Talking with ministers from all around the world, everyone is, these are challenging things to do. We are trying to change the way we regulate plastics, and it's not something we've done collectively ever, and we've been using plastics for decades and decades. So, to think that Canada is the only country that is facing some challenges in deploying solutions and in trying to change things, it's not the case. It is challenging in many countries, and I think the purpose of bringing all these countries together so that we can work on common policies and measures on things that everyone or close to everyone around the world will be putting in place will make it easier for us to do that, because right now it's a handful of countries that are doing things like ban on single-use plastic. But when it's 150 countries, or almost 200 countries, then it is going to be much easier to do that.
We've talked in the past, about COP and the ambition targets set on emission reductions globally, and some of the challenges that maybe some of the targets are too aspirational to meet in the timeframes that have been set for them, and the challenges that creates. And we saw coming into this conversation some of the delegates from the United States saying they don't want to come up with something on a plastics treaty that is too ambitious and we can't hit that target. They want something that is more realistic and achievable. Where do you stand on that? Is a slightly less ambitious treaty acceptable from a Canadian position if it gets you to an agreement that people can commit to?
I think I would respectfully disagree with our colleagues from the United States. I think that we have to be ambitious because science demands that we're ambitious, and it's probably an area where the Canadian public and frankly the public around the world is more seized with. When we're talking about things like greenhouse gas emissions, it's very intangible. People can't really see it, but when you're talking about plastic pollution, people see it. They see it in the streets. They see it when they go and walk in the forest, when they're at the beach, either here in Canada or abroad. So it's very tangible for the public, and we're being pushed by our public in Canada, in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, to do better as governments when it comes to fighting plastic pollution. So science is demanding it, our public is demanding it, and there are lots of alternatives. I've been meeting with companies that are developing alternatives to single-use plastics, for example, to better recycling methods, and to from the get-go to design plastics that will be easier to be reused and reused in the economy. So these things are possible, and I think we can do that.
So, Minister, just as a final point, while you try to figure out how to manage plastics going forward, there is still the challenge of today. And a lot of plastics that people think are going to recycling here in Canada get shipped overseas and end up in Myanmar and the Philippines and don't actually get treated with well. And the criticism has been people use export loopholes by going through other countries to be able to do that with plastic waste in this country. And it just moves the problem somewhere else. Is this something you need to get a handle on as a government to limit the overseas export of plastic waste from Canada and have it not be recycled and just become somebody else's garbage?
So in Canada, we're recycling about 9% of our plastics, which is what is happening on average around the world. But when it comes to the exports of plastics, there's two issues. Canada will be, we are working to ratify another UN treaty to ensure that if we are exporting products abroad, these products can be recycled. Then there's the issue of black market exports, and we know that some companies are not being particularly careful when it comes to that, and trying to circumvent our laws and regulations. So we need to do better on that as well. Obviously, controlling the black market is a bit more complicated, but certainly something we're very seized with as well.
Okay, Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Stephen Guilbeault, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate it, sir.
Thank you very much, David. Bye.